Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from the Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, the Bluestein Family Foundation, the Joan Ganz Cooney and Peter G. Peterson Fund, the Malkin Fund, the May and Samuel Rudin Family Foundation, the JoAnn and Kenneth Wellner Foundation, the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America. I'm Richard Heffner, your host on The Open Mind, and it's been nearly 2 years now since we first spoke here about ProPublica, journalism in the public interest. My guest was Richard Toffel, then and now its general manager, and today our Open Mind conversation about this truly unique, nonprofit venture in journalism, first underwritten with millions and millions of dollars by philanthropists Herbert and Marion Sandler, is with ProPublica's managing editor, Stephen Engelberg, who has been a managing editor at the Oregonian in Portland, and before that was at the New York Times for 18 years, with assignments in Washington, D.C., Warsaw, Poland, and the Big Apple itself. Much of his work was in investigative reporting. And of course it is investigative in journalism of a nonprofit nature that Steve Engelberg manages now. For as I introduced our program with Dick Toffel in 2007, ProPublica's own stated rationale for coming into being at this moment in our nation's history is quite direct. Presumably, it remains the same. The business crisis in publishing and the revolution in publishing technology are having a number of wide-ranging effects. Among these are the creation of original journalism in the public interest, and particularly the form known as investigative reporting is being squeezed down, and in some cases out. Profit margin expectations and short-term stock market concerns are making it increasingly difficult for the public companies that control nearly all of our nation's news to afford, or at least to think they can afford, the sort of intensive, extensive, and uncertain efforts that produce great investigative journalism. It is true that the number and variety of publishing platforms is exploding in the Internet age, but very few of these entities are engaged in original reporting. In short, ProPublica insisted, we face a situation in which the sources of opinion are proliferating, but sources of facts on which these opinions are based are shrinking. The former phenomenon is almost certainly, on balance, a societal good. The latter is surely a problem. Investigative journalism in particular is at risk. That is because more than any other journalistic form, investigative journalism can require a great deal of time and labor to do well. Given these realities, many news organizations have increasingly come to see investigative journalism as a luxury that can be put aside in tough economic times. Moreover, at many media institutions, time and budget constraints are curbing the once significant ability of journalists, not specifically designated investigative, to do this kind of reporting, in addition to handling their regular assignments. In all, ProPublica argued, this seems like a moment in the history of our country and the history of journalism when new models are necessary to carry forward some of the great work of journalism in the public interest that is such an integral part of self-government and thus an important bulwark of our democracy. And taking that, I would now ask Stephen Engelberg, its managing editor, how ProPublica has been living up to those brave thoughts expressed many months ago.
Well, it's certainly been a sort of interesting experiment. I think a lot of it, from our perspective, has gone better than we expected. The initial sort of question when those words were first being thought about and written was, could you create a nonprofit journalism enterprise, ProPublica, and see it have material that would be published in various places? Our model calls for us to both publish on our own website, ProPublica.org, but also to publish with partners, mainstream partners. And there was a real question mark when we began as to whether people would accept this journalism from outsiders. Well, since then...
When you say people, you mean...
editors of the major papers, broadcast, radio, and so on. And we have really had extraordinary good fortune since then in both finding material that we think was worthy of wider distribution, but also of it being accepted. So we've had stories in the New York Times, we've had stories in the Washington Post. Our first story was done in conjunction with 60 Minutes. We work with public radio. We're at work now with Frontline and PBS. So we've had a very, very, very broad acceptance of the notion that you can do investigative work from outside an organization and yet have it be sort of something that you'd want to present yourself, that there's value to it.
Why were you concerned to begin with about whether you would find those access points to the public?
Well, for a couple of reasons. I think, first of all, there is a kind of a journalistic ego, if you will. People like to do their own work, particularly at the highest possible levels. And so the question is, would that very sort of understandable instinct of pride and also of branding, stand in the way of accepting things that might have been done with others or by others? And what we found is that, if you have material that is sufficiently compelling, that is not a problem. And we don't want to be doing stories that, even a good newspaper or news organization would be doing anyway. Our goal is to do stories with what the Sandlers have called moral force, stories that bring change, and to do stories that wouldn't be done otherwise. And so we're not seeking to really compete with these organizations. We're seeking to extend their reach and the reach of investigative reporting generally.
Do your stories, when they appear, either in print or on the air, do they appear as your stories or as the medium's stories?
Well, it's a bit of both, in a way. I mean, we, of course, insist on some identification that these stories are ProPublica stories, but as I used to say when I was a reporter, it's my belief that only family members and competing journalists read bylines. So, when it says, by Abram Lustgarten, ProPublica in small letters, do people really even know it was by Abram Lustgarten, let alone ProPublica? So I think, we have had varying degrees of understanding that material that appears in places is our material versus that of the medium. I think within the blogosphere, within the internet world, it's quite clear what's ours and what isn't, because when you click on something, you come to our site, and that's very clearly sort of identified as ours. But I think it's a fair question. For example, we've done some excellent work we're very proud of with the national radio show Marketplace. You're driving in your car and it says Marketplace is now working with ProPublica and here's the story. Well, if you happen to just turn the radio on a moment too late, then it doesn't sound like us. Or if you weren't paying attention, it doesn't necessarily seem like us. But that's a fair trade. I mean, Marketplace has literally millions of listeners. It's a really well-produced show, and so we're happy to be there. And over time, we think that, the quality of our work and the fact that we're doing it will seep into the public consciousness.
What's the future then?
Well, I think the future, is a very sort of complicated thing in the media landscape right now. We don't really kind of know where things are going. I mean, one thing is clear from this conversation. We would be delighted to see the situation stabilize economically for our colleagues in, what we sometimes jokingly call the once for-profit sector. We would love to see profits return, and so that we are a supplement to what they're doing. Our ability to publish in a robust, healthy New York Times, is a great sort of way for us to get the story out. And so it's not yet clear how many of those organizations and in what form they will prosper or not prosper, in the coming years. Beyond that, we are continuing to try and build the sort of reach and power of our own website, and that's a slow process. I feel like we've made great progress from the day we didn't exist to today, but in the world of the web, I think if one is sort of the purveyor of serious, solid information, as we are, I mean, some of our best work, for example, is putting databases online. People love to come and sort of look at the data, about their state and the stimulus program and so on. But we are, to be absolutely honest, fairly serious. You will not find pictures of Lindsay Lohan on our site. So that's a problem, in the short run in terms of getting the sort of broad attention that one might want. I think over time, I mean, we have sort of slow but steady growth, and I think over time we will, develop an audience of sort of intelligent people who want to know more about what's going on than what they can glean from CNN.
We've been talking in generalities. What are some of the stories that you've, quote, published?
Yeah, well, we've done several things this year that I think have really fulfilled the Sandler's hope that ProPublica could have impact. One story that we did in conjunction with the Los Angeles Times was an exhaustive examination of the way the state of California regulates its nurses. And what we found was a level of, I don't want to say indolence, but let's just say casualness that was absolutely shocking, that you had in the state of California nurses who were beating up patients, were taking drugs, were involved in horrific medical errors, and the sort of disciplinary proceedings against them would be delayed for 3 to 4 years. So we published this story on a Sunday with the LA Times, and on Monday morning, Governor Schwarzenegger, who I'm sure is quite frustrated by his inability to solve their budget problems, saw this story and felt that this was a problem that he could solve. And so within a matter of days, he had either forced the resignations of or outright fired the entire nursing board and replaced them with a new nursing board. And he had gone further than that and discovered, as we were in the process of discovering, that in fact all of California's regulatory boards function roughly this way, and so he has moved, I think, quite decisively to try and address this by assuring Californians that, if there are allegations of wrongdoing against doctors or nurses or dentists, that they will be resolved, as other states do. I mean, one of the sort of important parts about this reporting, which we try to do in every one of our stories, is that we point to places where the thing actually works. There are states that don't take 4 years. Some states take 6 months. So we looked at places that had, much better procedures and a much more intelligent approach in our judgment. And I think that was part of what sort of prompted action here, was that not only did we identify a problem, but we showed the governor and the readers that the problem could be solved.
Okay, it's given. You did a great job.
Mm-hmm.
Just between us, my question would be, was there any negative feedback to the fact that the Los Angeles Times was publishing your story?
Well, I think in this case, the Los Angeles Times felt fairly comfortable with this venture, since the reporters that had done it previously worked for them, that this project had been sort of launched while they were still there. So in this case, it was a sort of truly, sort of multi-parent adventure. So I think that they can and do feel quite legitimately that this is as much their project as ours, and we certainly feel that way, that it's a venture that they absolutely began and we helped underwrite and bring to fruition over the period of nearly a year. It's a good question as to would they have felt quite as strongly if these people were strangers rather than familiar and beloved colleagues, and I think probably it would be a little bit less easy. But on the other hand, the other sort of recent thing that we did, we had an article that appeared in the New York Times Magazine about what happened during Katrina at a hospital in New Orleans. And the hospital had been cut off, no electricity, no power, et cetera, et cetera. And this was a case that had been written about previously. The doctors had given what they said was sort of sedatives, if you will, palliative care to patients who were near death. And we went back and looked at this, one of our reporters did, and she discovered that, in fact, the intent in some of these cases was to hasten the end of their lives. We had doctors, extraordinary, 2 doctors who actually acknowledged doing what amounts to euthanasia. And the New York Times ultimately, again, published some 13,000 words on this topic, which, as a former New York Times employee, I can tell you, even in the fat days, was a sort of not very normal event in the life of a New York Times reporter. And I think, Jerry Maserati, the magazine editor, wrote a very nice note at the front of the magazine about this, explaining to readers why they were working with us on this, and I think they felt a great deal of pride about publishing this and helping to shape it and bringing it home, and it's had enormous impact. So,
of course, I was so angry at the story itself that I appreciate what you're saying, and it was a tour de force, to be sure. Again, the question comes up. Was there negative feedback? What about the feeling of there, but for these scabs, go I?
Well, I think that is a quite sort of understandable reaction on several levels. First of all, the American newsroom today really is a place where people are being fired, which is something that was not true when I began in the business, but is a reality today. So people legitimately fear for their jobs. Fortunately, at the New York Times, you have a publisher in Arthur Sulzberger who has gone to extraordinary lengths to avoid that, to preserve his newsroom. But the fact is, they live in the world, they know what's going on. And so reporters there, I think, have, and everywhere, have an understandable nervousness about their own future and jobs, and that's first. Second, even, again, in the fat times, which I remember fondly, they seem only yesterday, even when we had a lot of money in the newspaper business, reporters are, surprisingly conservative with a small c. They really like things to be the way they've always been. You learn a way of doing something in the newspaper and media business, and you're really kind of resistant to change. So I understand that anything that sort of departs from the sort of experience and the sort of previous model is going to be met with a certain level of skepticism. Now, as an ex-employee, I no longer think I have my fingers on the pulse of the New York Times by any means. I last worked there in 2002. But what I do gather from the friends I have there is that in this case, the skepticism, if you will, was overcome by the quality of the work. I think if the work had been anything less than obviously original and stunningly detailed and breathtaking in its quality, the questions would have been much broader about why are we, giving, as you put it, these scabs a valuable newspaper.
You'll forgive me for putting it that way.
Not at all. I understand, the spirit in which it was meant, and I think that it would be a legitimate feeling if one worked at a news organization and felt that you were doing better stories than that which outsiders were having published, in their publication. So the simple answer to this, from our side of things, is to simply reach very, very high quality and not to in any way do sort of marginal journalism, which is the imperative that the standards have given us in the first place. They're not interested, again, in stories for the sake of stories or things that cover things that are available elsewhere. We should be doing unique work, unique and powerful work. And if we do that, I think we have a better chance with partners.
So you're suggesting that you don't have to worry about diffusing bombs in your own newsroom?
I think that if we do what we should be doing, the number of bombs should be at a minimum. I think every person today who is leading a newsroom is, to continue this metaphor, just one more step, is walking through a minefield at all times. I think that morale is tenuous. I think the fears of the reporters are legitimate. I think the pressures on reporters today are unlike those of any time, and certainly in my memory as a journalist. I mean, you are asking people to do more with less time. And in that environment, I think any news manager wants to be very careful about what they do that could affect morale. Now, having said that, what I think a good leader wants to also show his newsroom or her newsroom is that if we are publishing original material and we are making a difference through our partnerships or our own work, we are securing our future. And that I do believe. And I believe you do that any way you can.
It's interesting. You say news people are asked to do more with less time. And I just did a program here with Dr. Robert Butler, the distinguished physician, gerontologist. We're talking about American medicine, and he was saying doctors are asked to do more with less time. And maybe it's the curse of contemporary America. Mm-hmm. In medicine, in our health, and in our, what is perhaps in some ways even more important, in our knowledge of what's going on in the world. and in journalism. But do me a favor and tell me briefly about another well-received ProPublica.
Well, one of the things that we have done, which I'm very proud of, is that we began more than a year ago to look at what was at that point a very, very obscure issue, and one that has since exploded into widespread consciousness. It was the drilling for natural gas, which is a fascinating subject, very technical and yet very, very relevant. We are obviously, as we all know, in a period of extraordinary tumult in relation to energy and climate. We know, and this is quite clear and undeniable, that the electricity that we are producing, mostly with coal, has an extraordinary downside in that you send carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and it hastens global warming. A solution to this, which is quite viable, literally, perhaps 100 years worth of energy for the entire country, is natural gas. Amazingly enough, it's not in Saudi Arabia or under the ocean. It is under the ground in the United States. The technologies that have been invented in the last couple of decades allow you to free tiny little bubbles of gas very far down in the earth, in the shale, if you will. And so this is an important potential improvement to our energy picture. But the technology that is used for this, which is to pound water in at very high pressure and in very large amounts, is a technology that we don't know much about. And it turns out that the Congress in 2005 in the energy bill exempted the drilling from any kind of federal regulation. And the result of that is that each state is now, in essence, an EPA. And so we have a very patchwork arrangement of the regulation of this important industry. And the question that our reporter has been raising in a lot of different ways is whether or not the attempt to sort of address one environmental disaster, which is global warming, could be creating another environmental disaster, which would be the polluting of our groundwater. And so he has done upwards of 40 stories on this. They've run all over the country in various publications, including, I think quite strikingly, one of our first stories was about how New York was about to approve massive drilling in and around the New York City reservoirs. And the result of our story appearing in the Albany Times-Union and WNYC, which is the local PBS station here, is that the governor called a halt and has done ordered a more serious environmental assessment of whether or not this is a good idea. And interestingly, the city of New York has made it quite plain they do not want drilling anywhere near the reservoirs that provide the water to this city of 8 million people.
All of which leads me to ask you, whither ProPublica?
Well, our great hope as time goes forward, we are continuing to get the generous support of the Sandlers, but I think the Sandlers and us all see a value to having a more diverse base for funding. We are eagerly exploring that right now. We've gotten a generous grant from the Knight Foundation to hire a development kind of operation, create one, and see how you can make this a sort of more sustainable venture. Now, we have no illusions about sort of creating a commercial venture here. We're not ever going to be much different from, say, the museum, which both charges admission and raises money from members and has philanthropy. And, I don't know, before it's over, we may sell a ProPublica coffee mug, who knows. But the notion is to see how more broadly we can fund ourselves. In the area of journalism, I think we're trying to build on the early successes that we've had and to think hard about something that most editors, including myself, haven't always had to think about, which is if you have a choice virtually unlimited of stories that one could pursue, how do you pursue stories that are most likely to make a difference? And it's a little bit of a predictive issue. You don't always know. And so we're trying to learn from experience about how to refine that process. And we are still learning about how to use the web to advantage. I mean, we are first and foremost an organization that publishes through the web, and we are continuing to experiment in that realm. We hired, couldn't even call a reporter or an editor. She's a specialist. Her name is Amanda Mickle. She had worked for Huffington Post creating something called Off the Bus. It was a crowdsourcing project where people covered the campaign as volunteers. And we brought her aboard to try to bring some of that to our operation. And we've created a network now already of some 2,000 volunteers all over the country who are part of the ProPublica reporting network. And we're beginning to send them various queries and tasks, and they are beginning to report for us as volunteers. So I think that's an exciting venture for us that will bring results in the coming years.
Do you fear that success for ProPublica will lead, even if and when good times return, to print journalism, to a diminution of investigative journalism as we knew it, because you'll be there?
Well, people certainly have sort of raised that as a question, and I would hope that that is not what happens. I think if you look at American journalism, we have seen the layoff of, in the last year, some 10,000 reporters and editors. We are but 19. So I think if anybody were to feel that we were going to in some way, in any serious way, fill that gap, they're simply not doing the math. And as you pointed out in the opening, the problem is far broader than a paper that once had 3 investigative reporters now has 1 or none. The problem is if you stop covering in a robust way the State House or City Hall or the Planning Commission, and you do that in city after city and state after state, you don't know what you don't know. And that's the real threat to investigative reporting, is the loss of the eyes and ears that were the press up to this point.
Steve, we're reaching the end of our own program. All I can say is a year from now or so, got to get you back here and put the same questions to you, because you're going to be creating, making, developing the most interesting new event in journalism, and I appreciate your coming here with me today.
Thank you very much. It'll be a pleasure to come back.
Thanks. And thanks, too, to you in the audience. I hope you join us again next time. And meanwhile, as an old friend used to say, good night and good luck. And do visit the Open Mind website at theopenmind.tv. Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from the Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, the Bluestein Family Foundation, the Joan Ganz Cooney and Peter G. Peterson Fund, the Malkin Fund, the May and Samuel Rudin Family Foundation, the JoAnn and Kenneth Wellner Foundation, the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America.